Content warning. This episode contains discussions of child murder, sexual assault, psychological trauma, and disturbing audio evidence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. December 26, 1964, Boxing Day. A young man named David Smith walks into Hyde Police Station in Greater Manchester, England. He's pale, shaking, and barely coherent. When officers finally calm him down enough to speak, the story he tells seems impossible. The previous night, he says, he watched his wife's sister's boyfriend murder a teenager with an axe, and that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was his sister-in-law, his wife's sister, a woman he'd known for years, calmly cleaning up the blood while discussing where to bury the body. The worst part was realizing this wasn't their first time. The worst part was understanding that the couple he thought he knew had been hiding something unspeakable. David Smith had just discovered that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they invite you over for drinks. Intent. It's what separates an accident from a choice, a mistake from a deliberate act of evil. But what happens when two people find each other? Two people whose individual darkness, when combined, creates something far worse than either could accomplish alone. Today on Deadly Intent, we're examining one of Britain's most notorious murder cases, the Moor's murders. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 5 children, burying their bodies on Saddleworth Moor in northern England. But this isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about how intent can be shared, amplified, and weaponized when two damaged people validate each other's worst impulses. I'm Carman Carrion, and this is Deadly Intent. If you've been following this podcast, you know we examine the why behind the crimes, the intent that transforms thought into action. Usually, we're looking at a single perpetrator, trying to understand their individual psychology. But the Moor's murders force us to ask different questions. Can evil be collaborative? Can two people together become something more dangerous than either would be alone? And most disturbingly, can love itself become a vehicle for atrocity? The case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley suggests the answer to all these questions is yes. What makes this case particularly chilling is that we have extensive documentation of their crimes, not just confessions or forensic evidence, but audio recordings that Brady and Hindley made of their victims. These recordings, which I will not play and barely describe out of respect for the victims and their families, provide a window into the minds of perpetrators who didn't just commit murder. They documented it for their own entertainment. Before we begin, I need to acknowledge something. This case happened in 1960s Britain, but its impact reverberates today. The families of the victims have carried this pain for 6 decades. 2 of the 5 bodies have never been recovered, meaning families still wait for the chance to properly bury their children. As we explore this case, we're not just telling a story. We're walking on ground that's still sacred to people who lost everything. That responsibility shapes how we approach this investigation. So let's go back to 1961, to a chemical company in Gorton, Manchester, where 2 people are about to meet for the first time. Neither seems particularly remarkable, but together, they'll create a legacy of horror that Britain will never forget. January 1961, Millward's Merchandising, a chemical distribution company in Manchester. Myra Hindley, a 18-year-old typist, notices a new stock clerk, a dark-haired, brooding man named Ian Brady. She's immediately drawn to him. Brady is different from the other men in the office. He reads Nietzsche, listens to German marching music, and carries himself with an air of intellectual superiority that fascinates Myra. She begins documenting her obsession in her diary. "I hope he loves me and will marry me someday," she writes after their first brief interaction. Day after day, she records her growing infatuation. "Ian wearing a black shirt and looked smashing. I love him. I am going off my head thinking about him." But Ian Brady barely acknowledges her existence. For an entire year, he ignores her completely. To understand what happened next, we need to understand who these two people were before they found each other. Ian Brady was born Ian Duncan Stewart in Glasgow, Scotland, in 1938 to an unmarried mother who couldn't afford to raise him. He was fostered out to a local family named Sloan, who would later adopt him and change his surname to Brady. By all accounts, the Sloans treated Ian well. They weren't abusive or neglectful. But Ian Brady developed behavioral problems early. He was cruel to animals, engaged in petty theft, and showed a complete lack of empathy for others. At age 13, he appeared in juvenile court for burglary. At 16, he was charged with theft and spent time in Borstal, a youth detention facility. The pattern was clear. Ian Brady was someone who took what he wanted and felt no remorse when caught. In 1954, Brady's mother, who had since married and moved to Manchester, took him in, hoping a fresh start would straighten him out. It didn't. Brady continued his criminal activities, eventually landing a job at Millward's through a court-mandated program for young offenders. But Brady wasn't just a petty criminal. He was developing a sophisticated philosophy that would justify much worse crimes. Brady was obsessed with Nazi Germany, not the political movement, but the aesthetic of power and cruelty. He studied Hitler's speeches, collected memorabilia, and learned basic German. He read Marquis de Sade, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche, particularly focusing on concepts like the Übermensch, Nietzsche's idea of a superior individual who transcends conventional morality. Here's what's crucial to understand. Brady wasn't an intellectual. He was someone of average intelligence who cherry-picked ideas that justified what he already wanted to do. He didn't study Nietzsche to understand philosophy. He studied Nietzsche to find permission. Brady was building an intellectual framework that would allow him to commit atrocities without guilt. He convinced himself that he was beyond conventional morality, that ordinary people's suffering was irrelevant to someone of his supposed superiority. But Brady kept these beliefs private. At work, he was quiet, efficient, unremarkable. He was waiting for something, or someone, who could understand him. Myra Hindley came from a very different background. Born in 1942 in Gorton, Manchester, she grew up in a working-class family that struggled financially but provided a stable home. Myra was, by all accounts, a normal child. She was bright, popular, and athletic. She converted to Catholicism as a teenager and took her faith seriously, attending Mass regularly and volunteering with her church. The trauma that would later be cited to explain her crimes came when she was 15. Her close friend, Michael Higgins, drowned in a reservoir, and Myra blamed herself for not being there to save him. Some psychologists would later argue this event made her vulnerable to manipulation, desperate to prove she could be loyal and protective. But here's what troubles me about that narrative. Plenty of people experience childhood trauma and guilt without becoming murderers. The drowning of Michael Higgins was tragic, but it doesn't explain Myra Hindley's later actions. It only explains why she might have been searching for purpose and validation. What Myra Hindley wanted was to be special, to be part of something bigger than her ordinary working-class life. She wanted someone to see her as exceptional. Ian Brady would give her that feeling. and the price for that validation would be the lives of 5 children. In December 1961, after a full year of ignoring Myra's existence, Ian Brady suddenly asked her out. They went to see a movie, and afterward, Brady began sharing his worldview with her. He loaned her books, crime novels glorifying violence. He played her German military music and described his philosophy that conventional morality was for weak people, that superior individuals had the right to do whatever they wanted. And Myra, desperate to be seen as special, absorbed everything he taught her. Within months, Myra Hindley transformed completely. She dyed her naturally brown hair blonde. She traded her modest skirts for leather clothing and boots. She stopped attending church. Brady was an atheist and convinced her that religion was for fools. Most significantly, she began adopting Brady's belief system. In letters and conversations, Myra started referring to other people as maggots and morons. She discussed Brady's ideas about being beyond conventional law. She convinced herself that she and Ian were special, that ordinary rules didn't apply to them. This transformation might seem sudden, but it follows a recognizable pattern that psychologists call folie à deux, a shared psychosis where one person's delusions are adopted by another. But in Brady and Hindley's case, it wasn't mental illness that was shared. It was permission. Let's pause here and examine what we're witnessing. The formation of a collaborative criminal intent. Ian Brady had violent fantasies for years before meeting Myra Hindley, but he never acted on them. Why? Because fantasy and action are separated by an enormous psychological barrier. Most people who have dark thoughts never cross that line because they lack either the courage or the rationalization to transform thought into deed. Brady needed validation. He needed someone to tell him his ideas weren't monstrous. They were brilliant. He needed confirmation that his contempt for humanity was justified. Myra Hindley provided that validation, but she wasn't just a passive audience for Brady's philosophy. She actively participated in developing their shared worldview. When two people validate each other's worst impulses, something dangerous happens. The normal internal warnings that prevent most people from committing terrible acts get overridden. The little voice that says, "This is wrong," gets drowned out by another person's voice saying, "This is right." Criminal psychologists call this moral disengagement, the process by which people convince themselves that harmful actions are acceptable. Usually this happens gradually within an individual's mind, but when two people do it together, the process accelerates dramatically. Here's what makes Brady and Hindley's partnership so dangerous. They didn't just share intent, they created new intent together, building on each other's darkness until they'd constructed a shared reality where child murder was not only acceptable, but almost noble, an expression of their supposed superiority. By early 1963, less than 2 years after their first date, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley had stopped talking about violence in the abstract. They were ready to act, and they had already selected their first victim. July 12, 1963, a Friday evening in Gorton, Manchester. 16-year-old Pauline Reed was walking to a dance at the nearby Railway Workers Social Club when a woman in a van pulled up beside her. The woman was Myra Hindley, Pauline's neighbor, someone the teenager had known for years. Myra told Pauline she had lost an expensive glove on Saddleworth Moor and asked if Pauline would help her search for it. She'd pay her for her trouble, she said. Pauline agreed. She trusted Myra. Why shouldn't she? They drove to the moor, a desolate stretch of moorland about 15 miles from Manchester. When they arrived, Ian Brady was waiting. What happened to Pauline Reed on that moor is almost unbearable to describe. Brady sexually assaulted her, then cut her throat with such force that he nearly decapitated her. Henley later admitted to standing by and watching, possibly participating. They buried Pauline's body in a shallow grave and drove home. The next day, they went back to work as usual. Myra even attended Pauline's family's house, offering sympathy to the Reeds as they began their desperate search for their daughter. This detail is crucial. Henley didn't just help murder someone she knew. She then participated in the family's grief, studying their pain up close. The Reed family would search for Pauline for 24 years before learning what happened to her. Her mother, Joan, walked Saddleworth Moor repeatedly, calling her daughter's name, never knowing she was walking over Pauline's grave. But for Brady and Henley, the murder of Pauline Reed wasn't a trauma or a mistake. It was a success. They had crossed the line from fantasy to action, and nothing bad had happened. They hadn't been caught. They hadn't even been suspected. This reinforced their belief that they were indeed superior to ordinary people, that they could commit murder with impunity. 4 months later, they were ready to kill again. November 23, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated, a detail Brady and Henley would later cite as though a global tragedy somehow justified their personal one. 12-year-old John Kilbride had spent the afternoon at the local cinema in Ashton, Underline. He was walking to the market to catch his bus home when Myra Henley offered him a ride. John hesitated. He had been taught not to get into cars with strangers, but Myra was with a man, Brady, and she explained they were going his direction anyway. She seemed nice, normal. John got in the car. They drove John to Saddleworth Moor using the same excuse that had worked with Pauline. Myra claimed to have lost something and asked John to help search for it. Once on the moor, Brady sexually assaulted and strangled John Kilbride, then buried him near where they had buried Pauline Reed. The Kilbride family's anguish was immediate and public. John's mother, Sheila, appeared on television pleading for information about her son. She held up his photograph, described what he had been wearing, begged anyone who had seen him to come forward. Myra Henley and Ian Brady watched these broadcasts together. According to later testimony, they found them entertaining. Here's where we see their shared intent evolving into something even more disturbing. They weren't just killing, they were collecting the aftermath. The family's suffering became part of their entertainment, proof of their power over ordinary people. 6 months passed, then they killed again. June 16, 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett left his home in Longsight, Manchester, to visit his grandmother. He never arrived. Henley had approached Keith on the street and used the same excuse that had worked twice before. Keith, like John and Pauline, trusted the friendly woman who offered to help. Keith Bennett's murder was similar to the others: sexual assault, strangulation, burial on the moor. But this time, Brady and Henley added a new element. They took photographs. The police would later find dozens of photographs of Saddleworth Moor in Brady and Henley's possession, seemingly innocent landscape shots. But forensic analysis revealed that several photos showed the exact locations where bodies were buried, with Brady or Henley posed casually on top of the graves. They were creating souvenirs, commemorating their crimes, documenting their power over their victims even in death. Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie Johnson, would search for her son until her death in 2012, nearly 50 years of not knowing where her child was buried. Brady refused to reveal the location despite numerous appeals, taking that information to his grave in 2017. Keith Bennett's body has never been found. His mother died without being able to lay him to rest. But Brady and Henley weren't finished. Their final 2 murders would be even more calculated, even more cruel, and one of them would finally expose what they'd been doing. December 26, 1964, Boxing Day. 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey had spent the day at a fairground in Ancoats, Manchester. At around 5:30 p.m., she was approached by Ian Brady and Myra Henley, who claimed they would give her a ride home. Instead, they took Leslie Ann to Henley's grandmother's house, where the grandmother was conveniently away for the evening. Once inside, Brady and Henley forced Leslie Ann to pose for pornographic photographs. Then they turned on a tape recorder. What happened next was documented in audio that would become central to the trial and would shock Britain to its core. I'm not going to describe the contents of that recording in detail. Doing so would violate Leslie Ann's dignity and her family's pain. But I need you to understand what this recording represents. It's approximately 16 minutes of a child begging for her life. Leslie Ann can be heard pleading to go home, calling for her mother, asking what they're going to do to her. She's told to be quiet, to stop crying, to do what she's told. Brady and Henley's voices are also on the tape. Calm, matter of fact, treating this child's terror as though it's an inconvenience. The recording ends with music. Brady had turned on a radio, possibly to cover the sounds of what came next. Leslie Ann Downey was strangled and buried on Saddleworth Moor with the others. Brady and Henley kept the photographs and the audio recording in a suitcase, pulling them out periodically to relive what they had done. This is where we see the full evolution of Brady and Henley's shared intent. They weren't just killing. They were creating an archive of suffering that they could revisit at will. The murder itself was only part of their satisfaction. The ability to re-experience their victim's fear and pain was equally important. 10 months passed. During this time, Brady began talking to Myra's brother-in-law, David Smith, about his philosophy of crime and violence. Brady saw Smith as a potential recruit, someone else who might join their circle of superiority. Smith was 17 years old, married to Myra's younger sister, Maureen. He'd had minor run-ins with the law and liked to present himself as tough and streetwise. Brady mistook this posturing for genuine amorality. Brady began loaning Smith books, the same ones he'd given Myra years earlier. He talked about the perfectibility of crime, about how intelligent people could commit murder without being caught. He even hinted that he had already done it. Smith didn't believe him. He thought Brady was just talking big, until October 6th, 1965. That evening, Brady and Henley invited David Smith over for drinks. Around midnight, Henley walked Smith back to his home nearby, then asked him to walk her back to her house, claiming she was afraid of the dark. When they returned, Brady was waiting with 17-year-old Edward Evans, whom he had picked up at Manchester Central Station. What happened next would finally expose the full horror of what Brady and Henley had been doing. According to David Smith's testimony, as soon as they entered the house, Brady grabbed an axe and attacked Edward Evans, striking him repeatedly in the head. Henley held Evans' legs while Brady beat him. The assault was so violent that blood splattered the walls and ceiling. Smith stood frozen in shock, unable to process what he was witnessing. When it was over, Brady was laughing. He handed Smith the axe, possibly to implicate him, and calmly discussed how they'd dispose of the body. They wrapped Evans in a plastic sheet and carried him upstairs. Then Henley made tea while Brady cleaned up the blood. They discussed their evening as though nothing unusual had happened. Smith left as soon as he could, telling Brady and Henley he'd help them move the body the next day. But as soon as he got home, he vomited and then told his wife Maureen everything. At dawn, David and Maureen Smith went to a phone box and called the police. Several hours later, officers knocked on Myra Henley's door. Henley answered in a neat dressing gown, perfectly composed. When police asked to search the house, she agreed calmly. She claimed her boyfriend was asleep upstairs and asked officers to be quiet so they wouldn't wake him. In the bedroom, Police found Ian Brady writing a note explaining how to dispose of Edward Evans' body, which was in a locked bedroom down the hall. The arrest should have been the end of the story, but it was only the beginning of Britton's understanding of what Brady and Henley had done. In Henley's car, police found a detailed plan for another murder, targeting a teenage girl Brady had been following. In their house, investigators discovered the suitcase containing the photographs of Leslie Ann Downey and the audio tape of her final minutes. And when detectives examined those seemingly innocent photographs of Saddleworth Moor, they realized that they were looking at a burial map. The Moors murders investigation had begun. The audio recording of Leslie Ann Downey forces us to confront the most disturbing aspect of Brady and Henley's shared intent: documentation. Most killers try to destroy evidence. Brady and Henley preserved it, curated it, returned to it repeatedly for satisfaction. They created an archive of suffering that served multiple purposes. It was proof of what they had done, a source of ongoing entertainment, and evidence of their supposed superiority over ordinary people who couldn't stomach such things. But the documentation also reveals something about the nature of their partnership. When two people commit crimes together, there's often a clear dominant partner and a submissive partner. In the initial investigation, police assumed Brady was the dominant partner, the man with the violent fantasies who had corrupted an innocent young woman. But the evidence tells a more complex story. The tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey includes Myra Henley's voice, and her participation isn't passive. She's not just present. She's actively involved in directing the child, threatening her, controlling the situation. She's not being coerced. She's collaborating. This challenges our comfortable assumptions about gender and violence. We want to believe that women who participate in these crimes must be victims themselves, manipulated, abused, forced into participation by dominant male partners. Sometimes that's true. But in Henley's case, the evidence suggests otherwise. Henley was essential to their crimes in a way Brady could never have managed alone. She was the lure, the friendly woman who could approach children without triggering their stranger danger instincts. She was the trusted neighbor, the sympathetic female face that convinced families their children were safe. Without Henley, Brady couldn't have accessed his victims. She knew this, and she used it. Their intent wasn't hierarchical, it was symbiotic. Brady provided the philosophical framework that justified murder, but Henley provided the practical means to accomplish it. Brady wanted to kill, but Henley made it possible. And crucially, Henley didn't just participate, she innovated. The audio recording was reportedly her idea. She wanted to capture the victim's suffering in a permanent form, to create something they could revisit. This suggests that Henley's intent was every bit as malicious as Brady's, perhaps even more calculated, because she understood from the beginning exactly how essential her role was. The comfortable narrative that Myra Henley was simply dominated by Ian Brady falls apart when we examine what she actually did and how she did it. The trial of Ian Brady and Myra Henley began on April 19, 1966, at Chester Assizes. Britain had been following the case with a mixture of horror and fascination for months, but nothing could prepare the nation for what would be revealed in that courtroom. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Sir Frederick Elwyn Jones, faced an unusual challenge, proving that Brady and Henley had committed murders for which they had no physical evidence. The bodies of Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, and Keith Bennett hadn't been found yet. Only the graves of Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans had been located. The case would rest on photographs, the tape recording, and the testimony of David Smith. The defense strategy for both defendants was simple: deny everything except the murder of Edward Evans, which was impossible to deny given the body was found in their house. Brady's lawyer, Emlyn Hewson, argued that Edward Evans' death was the result of a fight that got out of hand, not premeditated murder. Henley's lawyer, Godfrey Halpern, went further, portraying his client as an innocent woman who had been completely dominated by the evil Ian Brady. Henley took the stand and presented herself as Brady's victim, a naive young woman who had been manipulated and terrorized into participating in crimes she didn't want to commit. But then the prosecution played the tape. The audio recording of Leslie Ann Downey being tortured was played in the courtroom on December 27, 1966. The public gallery had to be cleared because spectators were becoming physically ill. Jurors wept. Leslie Ann's mother, Ann West, collapsed and had to be carried out. But Myra Henley's reaction was what shocked observers most. She showed no emotion. She sat calmly, occasionally taking notes, as though she was listening to something that had nothing to do with her. When asked to explain the recording, Henley claimed that she had merely been present while Brady and another man abused Leslie Ann. She hadn't participated, she said. She had been too frightened of Brady to intervene or escape. The jury didn't believe her. The voice on the recording, Henley's voice, wasn't frightened or coerced. It was calm, authoritative, controlling. The prosecution also presented the photographs of Saddleworth Moor, which matched locations described in notes found in Brady's possession. Forensic analysis suggested that these photos had been taken to mark burial sites. Most damning of all was David Smith's testimony. Smith described the murder of Edward Evans in graphic detail. Brady's laughter, Henley's casual assistance, the methodical cleanup afterward. Smith's testimony was credible precisely because he incriminated himself. By helping dispose of the body plan, he had potentially made himself an accessory after the fact. On May 6, 1966, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned their verdict. Ian Brady was found guilty of all 3 murders: Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride. He was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences. Myra Henley was found guilty of 2 murders, Edward Evans and Leslie Ann Downey, and was convicted as an accessory in the murder of John Kilbride. She too received life sentences. Both were told they would serve a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. But Britain's collective fury meant they would never be released. The trial revealed the extent of Brady and Henley's crimes, but 2 bodies, Pauline Reed and Kenneth Bennett, remained undiscovered. Their families would continue searching Saddleworth Moor for decades, walking the same paths, calling out names, hoping against hope for closure. In 1987, 21 years after their convictions, Brady and Henley finally confessed to the murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. They agreed to help police locate the burial sites. Pauline Reed's body was found on July 1, 1987, almost exactly 24 years after her murder. Her family could finally lay her to rest. But Keith Bennett's body was never found. Despite numerous searches, Brady provided conflicting information about the burial site, and some investigators believed he was deliberately misleading them, enjoying one final opportunity to inflict suffering on Keith's family. Myra Henley spent the rest of her life trying to rehabilitate her image. She converted back to Catholicism in prison, earned a degree through Open University, and repeatedly applied for parole, claiming she had been a young woman manipulated by an evil man. She gave interviews portraying herself as a victim of Brady's psychological control, as someone who had been groomed and terrorized into participation. She built a narrative where she was not a perpetrator, but rather Brady's first victim. Some people believed her. Lord Longford, a Catholic peer, became her advocate, arguing that she deserved redemption and release. Several prison chaplains supported her parole applications, but the families of her victims never believed her, and the audio recording of Leslie Ann Downey made it impossible for the British public to see her as anything other than what she was: a calculated, collaborative killer. Ian Brady took a different approach. He never expressed remorse or sought parole. Instead, he embraced his monster status, giving interviews where he discussed his crimes in detail, claiming superior intelligence, taunting the families of his victims. In 1999, Brady declared himself insane and was transferred from prison to a high-security psychiatric hospital. He spent his final years on hunger strike, seeking the right to die, which British authorities refused to grant. Brady maintained one final piece of control: the location of Keith Bennett's body. Despite repeated appeals from the Bennett family, he refused to provide accurate information. He took that secret to his grave when he died on May 15, 2017, at age 79. Myra Hindley died in prison on November 15, 2002, at age 60, having served 36 years, longer than any other woman in British custody. She died without ever being released, without ever successfully convincing the world she was anything other than what the evidence proved: a willing, enthusiastic participant in the murder of children. Keith Bennett's body remains on Saddleworth Moor, somewhere, waiting to be found. As we conclude our examination of the Moor's murders, we need to confront the question that makes this case so disturbing. How could two people together become something so much worse than either might have been alone? The concept of folie à deux, shared psychosis, doesn't fully explain Brady and Hindley. This wasn't mental illness being transmitted from one person to another. This was shared intent, a conscious, deliberate choice by two people to validate each other's worst impulses until they had created a shared reality where child murder was acceptable. Criminal psychologists have studied collaborative killers extensively, trying to understand the dynamics that make these partnerships so dangerous. What they found is that collaborative crimes often follow a pattern. First, there's recognition. Two damaged people find each other and realize they share dark impulses that society condemns. This recognition creates a bond stronger than most romantic relationships because it's based on secrets that can never be shared with anyone else. Second, there's validation. Each partner reassures the other that their dark thoughts aren't monstrous but natural, even superior. This validation removes the internal restraints that normally prevent people from acting on violent fantasies. Third, there's escalation. The partners begin testing boundaries together, moving from fantasy to planning to action. Each successful crime reinforces their belief that they're special, that ordinary rules don't apply to them. Finally, there's documentation. The partners create evidence of their crimes, not despite the risk of being caught, but because the risk itself becomes part of the thrill. The evidence serves as proof of their shared experience, something that bonds them together in a way that normal relationships can never achieve. Brady and Hindley followed this pattern almost perfectly. But here's what makes this case unique. Unlike other collaborative killers who often target adults or commit crimes for financial gain, Brady and Hindley specifically targeted children. They weaponized the trust that society extends to women around children, using Hindley's gender as a tool to access victims who would never have gone with Brady alone. This suggests that their intent wasn't just to kill, it was to corrupt the fundamental bonds that hold society together. They wanted to prove that trust was foolish, that innocence was vulnerability, that anyone could be a victim. The Moor's murders changed Britain in ways that extend far beyond the direct victims. Before Brady and Hindley, British society operated on certain assumptions: that women weren't capable of sexually motivated violence against children, that friendly neighbors could be trusted, that evil announced itself in obvious ways. Brady and Hindley destroyed those assumptions. They proved that monsters could look like anyone, that women could be just as dangerous as men, that collaborative evil could be worse than anything one person could accomplish alone. The psychological impact of their crimes rippled through British society for generations. Parents became more protective, more suspicious. The concept of stranger danger became central to child safety education. Communities that had once been trusting became vigilant. In some ways, Brady and Henley succeeded in their ultimate intent. They became the monsters they wanted to be, figures whose crimes would be remembered and feared long after they were gone. But they failed in another way. They wanted to be seen as superior, as transcending conventional morality. Instead, they're remembered as exactly what they were, two damaged people who found each other and chose evil. Because that's the truth that cases like this ultimately reveal. Evil isn't sophisticated or superior. It's not proof of intelligence or strength. Evil is a choice, and sometimes two people choose it together. The Moor's murder case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for collaborative evil. We want to believe that people like Brady and Henley are aberrations, monsters so fundamentally different from us that we could never become like them. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Brady and Henley weren't born evil. They became evil through a series of choices: to indulge dark fantasies rather than suppress them, to seek validation for their worst impulses, to value their own satisfactions over the lives and suffering of children. The lesson of the Moor's murders isn't that monsters walk among us, though they do. The lesson is that monsters are made through the accumulation of choices, and that sometimes two people can make each other worse by validating impulses that should be rejected. The most dangerous people aren't always the obvious predators. They're the ones who learn to weaponize trust, to exploit the compassion and cooperation that make human society possible. Myra Henley could approach children because she looked safe, normal, trustworthy. She was a neighbor, a familiar face, someone's sister. The very qualities that should have made her protective made her deadly instead. But there's another lesson here, one that's especially important for the families who are still affected by these crimes. Joan Reed, Sheila Kilbride, Winnie Johnson, Ann West, the mothers who lost their children to Brady and Henley, spent decades fighting to keep their killers imprisoned. They attended every parole hearing, wrote countless letters, gave interviews, organized campaigns. They refused to let the world forget what had been done to their children. These mothers transformed their grief into purpose. They ensured that Brady and Henley never successfully rewrote their own narratives, never convinced the world they deserved freedom or sympathy. Winnie Johnson died in 2012 without ever finding Keith's body. But before she died, she established the Winnie Johnson Foundation to support other families of missing children. She turned her own suffering into a resource for others facing similar pain. That's the real victory over Brady and Henley's intent. They wanted to destroy families, to leave behind nothing but trauma and devastation. Instead, the families they victimized became advocates, educators, voices for other victims. The mothers of the Moor's murder victims proved something crucial. Evil can inflict terrible damage, but it can't destroy the human capacity for love, purpose, and resilience. Today, Saddleworth Moor is still searched periodically by volunteers and investigators, hoping to find Keith Bennett. His brother and other family members continue the work their mother began, refusing to give up hope that Keith can finally be brought home. The story of the Moor's murders doesn't have a happy ending. It can't. 5 children are dead, families were destroyed, and one body remains lost on the moor. Evil is collaborative sometimes, but so is resistance. Communities that come together to protect their children, families that refuse to let victims be forgotten, investigators who never stop searching. These collaborative acts of good ultimately outweigh collaborative acts of evil. Brady and Henley wanted to prove that they were superior to ordinary people, that conventional morality was for weaklings, that they could inflict suffering without consequences. They failed. They spent the rest of their lives in cages, despised by the nation, remembered not as superior beings but as cautionary tales, and the families they tried to destroy found ways to survive, to honor their lost children, to ensure that those children were remembered as more than just victims. If there's any justice in this story, it's that Brady and Henley's intent ultimately destroyed only themselves. Thank you for listening to this episode of Deadly Intent. I want to acknowledge how difficult this case is to hear about, especially for anyone who has lost a child or knows someone who has. The Moor's murders case touches the deepest fears we have about our ability to protect the people we love. If this episode has affected you or if you need support, resources are available. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children operates a 24-hour hotline at 1-800-THE-LOST. In the UK, the charity Missing People can be reached at 116-000. I also wanted to note that the families of the Moor's murder victims have requested that Saddleworth Moor be treated with respect. If you visit the area, please remember that it's not just a historical crime scene. It's sacred ground where children are buried and where one child still waits to be found. This episode was researched using court transcripts, police records, contemporaneous news coverage, and the book The Moor's Murders, The Trial of Myra Henley and Ian Brady by Jonathan Goodman, as well as interviews with investigating officers that have entered the public record over the decades. Next time on Deadly Intent, we'll examine a very different kind of case. But until then, remember, evil exists, and sometimes it finds partnership. But good also finds partnership in families who refuse to give up, communities that protect their own, and investigators who never stop searching for truth. The capacity for collaborative evil is real, but so is the capacity for collaborative resistance. Stay safe out there and hold your loved ones close.